Hello there and welcome to another live chapter reading for Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Today I shall be reading from The Lightning Horse, an Empire at Twilight novel by N.L. Holmes. Chapter 1. This is what it means to be a charioteer, thought Tuatipara in awe. Not a diplomat, an emissary, but a driver of horses. A charioteer was a man who cracked the whip, and a pair of powerful, perfectly trained animals sprang forward, devouring the earth before them with a roar like a clap of thunder. How their manes streamed behind them, rippling like battle flags, how their hooves beat the black earth, throwing clods and tufts of dry grass at the spectators. Wasn't the god of lightning, Tahunta Piasashi, the first charioteer? The sight of a team swallowing the black earth in a furious speed never failed to swell the heart of Tuatipara, son of Powahtalma. His eyes followed the vehicle as it made the turn. His father bent over the leads. "It's like riding a lightning bolt," he said to his friend Zidanza at his side. "Try not to sound too much like the child jumping up and down inside him. Their power, their nobility, you can't imagine the horses doing anything ignoble, can you? It wouldn't be happy in any other profession." "I don't know," Zidanza vaguely, his gaze on the galloping animals. "It's rare that I get to take a team out, and even then it's only for the distance of a few ikus. But I do love being around them." He gave his amiable grin. "Feeding them isn't quite as dangerous as driving them." Zidanza was a groom of the royal stables, and even though he was a prince of sorts, descended from the great Tudalia, he was a mild young man with a round face and sleepy eyes that held a curious mixture of lassitude and anxiety. By and large, he was slow-moving and even lazy, which nicely balanced Tuatipara's crackling energy. They had been friends since childhood. Tuatipara dragged his eyes away from the team that thundered past him. King Hattusili was testing out the new horses he had bought from Korean merchants in Carchemish, and Tuatipara's father, the Hashtalanuri, the king's own driver, was in the box. The young man's family had served the king in honour past of charioteer as long as there had been a king of Hattiland. Since the first men of Hatti had come forth from Kashara and established themselves in the old capital of their predecessors, defying the curse on Hattusha to make it the heart of a mighty empire. Tuatipara took pride in that heritage. Only the cream of Hatti's aristocracy could touch these priceless horses, even to serve them their mash or brush their sleek, glistening coats. A job that might seem menial became an act of high ceremony when performed for the royal horses. Many of the drivers, and even the grooms, were like Zidanza, princes of the blood. Tuatipara continued to assemble the royal chariot, forcing the two tall wheels onto the axles, slathered with sheep fat, and hammering in the cotter pins while Zidanza held it steady. Tuatipara dropped his mallet into the toolbox on the ground, and Zidanza pushed it aside with his foot. The charioteer laid the long draught pole with its fixed double yoke out before the vehicle. With one eye still on his father's headlong course around the field, marked by a great plume of dust, Tuatipara set the harness leathers on the floor of the box until he could bring the horses from their stalls. Not far away, at their backs to him, stood a crowd of grooms, drivers, and royal princes, all watching with excitement the test of the first pair of horses. The king's three oldest sons, young men about Tuatipara's age, were among them, including Prince Nerakaili, the Tukanti or crown prince of Tuatipara's employer. Hishni, the third in age, cried eagerly, "Look at those demons fly! I've never seen such power." But Tuatipara smiled to himself. They hadn't seen the best team yet. He headed back into the royal stable, and the thunder of hoofs and the roar of the crowd faded. It was always quiet, hushed in nearly a religious sense, inside the long stone-walled bars that housed the king's horses. High-spirited lightning bolts through, though they might be on the field, the stallions were tranquil and well-mannered in repose, except perhaps when the mares were in heat. Piasashi's boys were so perfectly trained that Tuatipara would have trusted them to step over his prone body. In fact, every day he entrusted his body to them as he did now, entering the box of the storm cloud on Tahunta. The big beast rolled his eyes and jerked his head away, but only to be contrary. He knew the appearance of a human holding a bridle signified, "Go have fun, run and run fast." You know what this means, don't you, my beauty? Cooed Tuatipara in his hoarse, calming voice. He ran a hand over the horse's dappled hide and down his muscular chest and long, powerful leg, which darkened into a silvery black along the cannon as it approached the hoof. The horse's skin shivered at Tuatipara's touch, as if in umbrage at the familiarity, and the youth laughed, his voice rich with affection. Yes, we're both a little touchy, aren't we? You're my soulmate, young man. I may never have the chance to drive you. Not until Prince Nerikaili becomes king, at least. But you and I understand each other, don't we? He slid the bridle into the horse's mouth and pulled the straps back behind the animal's head, pulling each ear through with a little felted pop. At the age of 22, Tuatipara loved everything about his life. He had worked in a royal stable since he was old enough to toddle at his father's side with a bucket of barley, and he couldn't imagine doing anything else. He loved the smell of horses, warm and pungent, the feel of their muscular movement through the sleek pelt, and the challenge of their often crafty intelligence. The emotional connivance that let a mere man direct these immensely more puissant creatures who were none the less fearful and in need of reassurance. Tuatipara led Stormcloud out into the corridor and tied the stallion to a ring in the wall until he had bridled the animal's teammates, Silver Lightning. Then he took the pair of them back outside, accompanied by the counterpointed clopping of 8 hooves upon the hard ground. On the practice course, Tuatipara's father, Powatelma, was just pulling up to the knot of the observers, reining in his overstimulated team gently and insistently. There's a man who knows how to drive, thought Tuatipara, his heart swelling with pride. His father wasn't a tall man, but he was solid, with a strong pair of shoulders hewn by a lifetime of driving these high-strung beauties, powerful arms and broad calloused hands in perfect control of the leads. The pair of big bay stallions, running pace for pace with one another, slowed, their heads up, nostrils round from exertion, stately and beautiful in a cloud of dust. A groom reached for his reins, and father leapt down from the back of the box, his face red and glistening with exhilaration. "What do you think, Powatelma?" cried the king, grinning broadly. "Did I get taken, or are they worth the price?" At his side, Hattusili's friend Bentashina, the former king of Amuru, said with an exaggerated mood, "They'll do." He seemed incapable of speaking seriously about anything. "Well worth it, my son, whatever you paid for them. They are a magnificent pair," agreed Tuatipara's father. "There's more and better to come. Where's the other team?" "Ah, Tuatipara, it's you hitching them up. Ha! Show your father these beauties, my boy." Beside the king, Tapalatohunta, Tuatipara's grandfather, laughed and clapped his grandson on the shoulder. He had been the king's driver in his youth, and more recently, during the war for the throne, Tuatipara led the 2 dappled stallions forward for his father's admiration. Powatelma ran his hands over their legs, opened their lips and eyed their teeth. "Well matched," he commented. "Impressive conformation. Let's see what they've got. Hitch 'em up, Tipper." "I'm going to join you on this run," said Hattusili, still grinning. He turned to his eldest son, Nerikali, who had drawn closer to see the 2 stallions. "Tell your stepmother to come on out if she wants to see something beautiful." He turned to Tuatipara's father. "I saw them run in Carchemish, Powatelma. You can hardly believe how they seem to think with one mind." The men were still talking and laughing behind him as Tuatipara led the horses back to where the king's chariot sat parked. It was a massive war car with a 3-man box of bronze-bound scarlet wood and wheels as tall as a man's hip, at least for a fairly short man such as he was. To pull a vehicle like that at breakneck speed was a real test of the team's stamina, but that was what they had to do on the battleground. Zidanza stood beside the chariot, leaning against the box with crossed arms as he watched the activity on the field. He blinked sleepily and stepped back as his friend approached with the horses. Tuatipara winked at him, scarcely able to contain his high spirits. "Show our son what you're made of, boys," Tuatipara told the pair as he pulled first one and then the other alongside the draft pole, and nudging them toward the centre with his chest, lowered the yoke over their withers. Automatically, with the expertise of one who had been harnessing horses since childhood, Tuatipara laid the saddles and checks in place, tied up all the straps, and ran the line through the terrace as he listened with one ear to the king and his men in the distance. He gave an extra pull to the breeching strap and tugged just to be sure. He was a cautious lad who had been trained by cautious men. Then he made sure the blinders cleared the animals' eyes, and he led them back to the practice field, Zidanza in his wake. Their coming was met with whistles of appreciation and a babble of excitement. Tuatipara saw his father and grandfather grinning at the king, and Hattusili's 3 oldest sons exchanged something hastily. They're making bets, Tuatipara said, amused, to his friend. I wouldn't trust that Lermaziti not to cheat. After you, my son, Powatelma gestured to the king, and Tapala Tohunter made a stirrup of his hands for Hattusili to mount the box. The king, a tall, thin, middle-aged man, his ugly face lit with boyish eagerness to hold himself up. He laughed at his sons and Bentashina on the ground below. Then Powatelma jumped up beside him and took his place on the king's left, shortening up the leads. Tapala Tohunter, cried the king in his rough voice, come and join us for old time's sake. It's not a real test unless they're pulling 3 men. Tuatipara's grandfather heaved himself up without further coaxing. He would play the shield-bearer at the rear. Powatelma had just eased the animals into a walk to turn them onto the practice field when a page boy came running from the direction of the stable. He shot towards the field after the chariot, his footsteps making little puffs of dust in the tattered dead grass. My son, he cried, waving his arms. The men on board turned as the driver drew them to a halt. What is it, damn it, yelled the king. The boy trotted up beside the vehicle, panting. There's Tawanana said to tell you there's a messenger from Karduniash, my son. She said it's very important and that you need to hear him and formulate a reply. Hattusili stifled a curse and squinted around as if he hoped someone could rescue him from his interruption. Finally he said, all right, tell her I'm on my way. He aimed an elaborate shrug at his sons. All bets are off, boys, and he clapped Tuatipara's father and grandfather on the shoulders and let himself laboriously down from the box. Should we wait for your return, my son? Asked Powatelma. No, go ahead, impress the others. I've seen these gorgeous fellows in action. The king gave Stormcloud an affectionate slap on the rump as he passed, then Hattusili strode off toward the stable on his long legs. So, show us what they've got, Powatelma, called Prince Nerikaili from the sidelines in his smooth baritone. Hishni and Lermaziti stood beside him, the latter smirking. Tipper, do you want to join us as the third man? Called Powatelma. Tuatipara had just begun to run eagerly toward the vehicle when Nerikaili stopped him. Did you finish repairing that collar you were working on, Tuatipara? No, my lord, he admitted, dreading what was coming. And I'd rather you did that. I need it tomorrow. Yes, my lord, he replied, lowering his eyes with a pang of disappointment and even resentment that his prince couldn't wait while he, Tuatipara, had the ride of his life, sharing such a moment with his father and grandfather, 3 generations of charioteers in one box. You coming, son? Called his father. No, I have things to do, he replied with a forced smile. He was a soldier and orders were orders. He would never admit the depth of his disappointment. Powatelma clucked the team up into a trot, and already one could see how perfectly matched the pair were, not only in appearance but in spirit as well. Usually one horse would pull hard while the other was content to come along, much like Tuatipara and Dizanza. But Stormcloud and Lightning seemed to exult in the competition, each springing ahead against a load of 2 men and a heavy wooden car. Tuatipara watched, holding his breath in admiration as the vehicle disappeared towards the other end of the field in a storm of hoofbeats and dust. Then he made his way with a deep sigh of resignation towards the stable. It was silent inside. Everyone was at the field watching the new horses. Only an occasional ruffle of equine breath or the scrape of hoofs disturbed the heavy golden quiet of the place, with its straw-covered floors and moat-filled air. Tuatipara snuffed the sweet, hay-perfumed atmosphere as he made his way to the tack-room and took down the collar he had begun to repair. It was part of Nerikaili's ceremonial harness. He would indeed need it for the next day's festival procession. There was a rip in the seam, but Tuatipara saw that he had almost completed restitching it. A few minutes' work remained, no more, and it wasn't altogether clear to him why one of the grooms couldn't take care of it. Normally such things were their job, but the ultimate responsibility was the charioteer's, and Tuatipara was a perfectionist, often choosing to do things himself. For this I missed a chance to test the new team with my father and grandfather. He heaved a mighty breath as he laid the collar down and found a big curved needle and threaded it with the length of thin gut. Then, sitting on the only bench in the tack-room, he proceeded to stitch carefully through the old holes. From off in the distance, Tuatipara heard a faint thunder of wheels and hoofs as the team approached the near end of the field again, and the whistles and shouts of the onlookers. But he wasn't one to rush a job. He finished it at a meticulous pace, then put away his equipment before hanging the collar with the other pieces of the harness. At last, Tuatipara jogged back out to the field. The king had returned from his diplomatic distraction and was joking with the men, even as the royal eyes stayed fixed on the thundering team and the 2 men in the chariot, their heads low, the long hair flying behind them. Faster, Hattusili shouted, and the crowd joined in the cry. Faster, faster. Tapala Hunter shook his fist as if brandishing a spear, and the team pounded around the curve, barely slowing. From the horse's lips, foam slung out at the onlookers, and Nerikaili laughingly wiped his cheek. Tuatipara saw his father's face, wild with the joyous thrill of the speed, before Powatelma completed the turn and sped away. Now the length of the field stretched before the chariots. Powatelma laid his long whip with a crack upon the eager backs of the horses. The animals, who were already flying like the wind, seemed to find within them some secret reserve of power, as if their feet had sprouted wings. Their stride lengthened impossibly, and they shot forward like the very horses of the lightning god. Tuatipara was so moved by the sheer beauty of it that his nose began to burn. The dancer at his side was as tense as a drawn bow. Then something happened. There was a lurch of the box. The chariot rocked and fell to the ground on one side with such an infernal screech and a crash. A wheel spun off drunkenly across the field. Tuatipara's grandfather catapulted out between the horses' backs. The chariot flipped sideways on top of him and kept sliding. His father, thrown likewise over the rail, still had the lines in his hands as the dragon cart braked the animals brutally. They fell against one another, their legs in the air, and rolled and kicked against the weight of the box as it slid into them. The draft pole splintered. Powatelma was ploughed under the chariot and the horses' bodies as they screamed in pain and fear, striking out desperately with their hoofs. All this happened in an instant, surely, but every action was printed in agonizing detail into Tuatipara's sight, as if time slowed down for those few terrible beats. His heart seemed to stop. A great cloud of white dust surrounded the wreck. A massive furrow smeared with blood followed up the slide of the chariot, one whose one wheel spun helplessly in the air. The horses' shrieks rose in the unashamed terror of injured animals, but the two passengers were silent, buried under the overturned chariot and the struggling horses. Zidanza gripped Tuatipara's arm and sucked in a breath of gas. Among the spectators no one moved for a horrified instant. Then everyone ran at once. Tuatipara bursting into the lead, he pounded round the field, his heart in his mouth. "Father! Grandfather!" he shouted. "What happened? Was it something I did, or something I left undone? Why did the chariot throw a wheel?" Stormcloud struggled to right himself, but he hadn't the strength. His blood was pumping out, saturating the harness and ground. His big eyes rolled in mortal fear. He bared his teeth in a scream of uncomprehending agony. Tuatipara squatted behind the overturned car and tried to heave it up off the animal, but it was too heavy, until someone lent a shoulder at his side. It was the king, his lips drawn back from his crutted teeth in a grimace of effort. The box fell to its base with a crash, and the other wheel fell off. Tapala Hunter lay where he had been mown down by the heavy wooden box, flat on his face, covered by a tangle of hair, his legs at unnatural angles, bloody and unmoving. Dear gods, moaned Tuatipara, sinking to his knees. Everything seemed strangely sharp and sparkling. His hands were quivering like poplar leaves in the breeze. He wondered if he were going to faint. An infinitely remote voice said, "Who's got a knife? Put these horses out of their pain, man." I should be doing that. I should be the one doing that, he thought, but he seemed incapable of movement. The horses' screams stopped abruptly, one after the other. The men cut harness straps and dragged the dead animals out of the way. Stormcloud had been impaled on a splintered pole. Both of them had broken legs, perhaps ribs, priceless, wonderful, and dead. Tuatipara was dimly aware as the dancer throwing up beside him. Under the horses lay his father, his tunic half ripped from him by the abrasion of the earth. Powatelma was a bloody, mangled pile of something less than human, crushed by the weight of the animals and the bashing corners of the wooden vehicle. Tuatipala crawled towards him and fell on his face at his side, and suddenly the sobs that had trembled within him came pouring out in desolate howls. This man had raised him all alone for 22 years after the death of Tuatipara's mother in childbirth. He was all the young man had. "Father, father, all you gods, what did I do wrong?" Tuatipara sobbed into the dry grass, fearing to touch his father none the less, as if it might increase his pain. But Powatelma felt no pain. Powatelma, son of Tapala Hunter, was clearly dead. At last, not caring that he was covered with Powatelma's blood, Tuatipara fell upon his father's back. Men of Hattiland weren't supposed to cry, but he wailed unashamedly. Thank you for listening to this chapter reading. I hope you enjoyed it and that you'll go check out the book. Thanks very much for watching. Bye bye.